Thank you. Thank you. I wish this could be a happier occasion, because I don't bring any good news, because we're having really big problems in Flint right now with the water. But I just want to give you an overview of what's going on there right now. We'll talk a little bit of background, talk about the city, the people, we'll talk about the infrastructure, and then we'll concentrate on the response, and I'll present different scenarios about what may happen or what could happen. So we'll talk about the origins of the water crisis, look at some of the social and social political factors and the physical aspects of it. Flint, like many northern cities in the United States in the Rust Belt, has an aging water infrastructure. Most of the pipes were built in the 1920s to the 1940s, and they had about an 80 to 100 year lifespan. So if our math is good, we know we're running out of time right now. And that's an average lifespan. So we're already seeing over 300 main breaks per year in the city of Flint. Talk a little bit about lead. We have as bad as the situation is in Flint, we have a unique opportunity to turn this into a positive model for how to abate lead nationwide. Lead is really it's a scourge in the environment. We've got a lot of homes that have lead paint. There's residual lead in soil that has been there from the use of tetraethyl lead in automobiles, and that was outlawed only in 1978. And lead is very immobile in the soil, so it stays near the surface, which makes it very accessible to children who are playing in the soil and they put their hands in their mouth. And that in itself is the #1 exposure pathway for lead among children, is that hand-to-mouth activity. We still have a lot of lead paint in old homes. Flint's average age of house is 74 years, 1942. So we have a lot of homes in Flint that probably have lead paint as well. You can get rid of lead paint either the hard way, which is about $8 to $12 per square foot of removal, which is going to cost an average house about $10,000, or you can encapsulate it if you don't have any peeling. We'll talk a little bit about assessing the risk in Flint. Right now we have some real gaps in that, and causing some concern. We have a lot, justifiably so, a big focus so far has been on looking at those who have been most directly affected and those who are the most vulnerable, which are the children. Children are most susceptible to lead because their blood-brain barrier is not fully developed. The ratio of their body weight to the amount of fluid they ingest is also a lot higher, or a lot lower than adults. So an average adult would have to drink 3 gallons of water to drink a similar portion of the amount of fluids that children aged 0 to 2 drink. So nursing mothers are also at high risk. Lead gets into the placenta, and it's a neurotoxin. So it causes irreversible brain damage. That is one of the huge problems with lead. You can mitigate some of the effects with proper nutrition, and that's important to make the intervention very quickly. But unfortunately, lead only stays in the blood, has a half-life of about 20 to 30 days. So unless you catch it early, it may not show up in a blood test. And there isn't a really good, effective blood test to show any long-term exposure right now. We'll talk about, when Mark Edwards from Virginia Tech came to Flint and did some water testing, he found high levels of lead. And shortly thereafter, Dr. Hannah Tisha at Hurley Medical Center found elevated blood levels after she reviewed records of children's blood level testing in different areas of the city, and it was quite extensive. The day after those results came out, myself and other members of our Geographic Information Systems Center at University of Michigan Flint, we approached the city of Flint and said, we'd like to map your lead pipes for you. So we went over to the city and they showed us 45,000 index cards. Looked like an old card catalog. I mean, you got it easy now. I mean, everything's on computer, but when I grew up, things were in cards, and you would look through a card system to go find your book. Now you just go online and there it is. But that's what they had. And it was written, a lot of them were written in pencil. They were smeared. Data were missing. But fortunately, they had transferred some of those cards, some of the information on the cards, onto parcel maps. And then they scanned the parcel maps into TIFF files, tagged image format files, and had 240 separate image files. So we did a little project where we knitted all those files together, georeferenced them, which gave them geographic control to existing parcel maps, and then we transferred the codes that were on the maps, indicating what type of service line connection there was, onto a database. I'll show you all that in a few minutes. I want to talk to you about lessons learned from other water disasters. This hasn't been talked about too much, but we've had a couple major disasters in the United States with respect to drinking water. The most notable was in Wisconsin and Milwaukee in 1993. It was a cryptosporidium outbreak. 400,000 people were sickened and 69 people died. So there's some lessons from there as well. Talk briefly about some government and community roles which we might want to put into effect. And then finally, I'm going to present 3 recovery scenarios. These are just sort of, I would call them the Home Depot type of thing, good, better, best type of a way of approaching the problem. So, the American Society of Civil Engineers every 4 years, produces a report called the Report Card on the Nation's Infrastructure. It's kind of like the Infrastructure Olympics every 4 years. And the last one was done in 2013, and the status of America's infrastructure overall was given a D+. The status of drinking water infrastructure was given a D. Now, on what basis do these low grades get awarded? It has to do primarily with the age of the infrastructure, which is outmoded. Most of the pipes in this country were laid during the 1890s, 1920s, or the 1950s. Those laid in the 1920s, lifespan is up very soon. Now, Flint is a city that grew rapidly between 1920 and 1950, reaching a population of twice of what it is today in the mid-1950s, early 1960s. It's since gone down by half. I mean, we've gone from 196,000 people in Flint to only 102,000 today in less than 35 years. The other thing that the American Society of Civil Engineers bases their grading scale on is what they call the funding gap. What needs to be funded versus what is actually funded in terms of addressing the problems. And this funding gap is getting bigger every year, where we need to address more and more infrastructure, but we're spending less and less on it. So that's a big problem. Flint's pipes, like most of those in the northern states and the east side and the eastern United States, are made out of cast iron. They were laid in the 1920s. Some of them may have been joined with what are called bell and spigot joints, and bell and spigot joints were sometimes joined with poured lead. So there might be some lead still present in the main system. Those are the pipes that run under the streets. Our real concern in Flint now is with the service pipes that run at right angles from those main pipes into people's homes and buildings. It's those 1-inch or 3/4-inch pipes where corrosion has released a lot of the lead, and that's been the big problem. Flint has an old infrastructure. It also has an old housing stock. In 1986, the United States, in an amendment to the Safe Drinking Water Act, outlawed lead in plumbing. Before 1986, it's quite possible that any home that was built before then has lead in their interior plumbing, which we call premise plumbing. The utility is typically responsible for all the infrastructure up to what's called the curb stop. That's a place at the curb of people's homes where there's a switch that allows the utility to shut off the water. It's a valve. And if you look on your front lawn, if you have a home, you'll notice a little metallic covering on your lawn. And you can pop that thing up, but you can't do anything with it because you don't have the key to turn the switch. Only the utility has that key. That's in case of some type of emergency with your house where they have to shut the water off. Everything else from the curb stop into the house is the homeowner's responsibility. So your pipes from the curb stop into the house through your water meter, all your interior plumbing pipes, and your fixtures. That's what we call premise plumbing. So we have two essentially different types of plumbing. We have the infrastructure plumbing, that's the city's responsibility, and then we have the premise plumbing, which is the homeowner's responsibility. Also want to talk a little bit about pipe corrosion, give you an overview of what happened in Flint. In short, by taking river water, they took a source of water that was 8 times more corrosive in terms of its chloride content than the Lake Huron water they had been using previously. And that was a big problem. So this shows the major periods of pipe installations in the United States, 1880s, 1920s, and 1950s. Another change occurred in 1970 when we switched from cast iron to ductile iron. Ductile iron has a little bit different arrangement of the graphite in the metal. It's more spheroidal, has a little better longevity. The cast iron pipes, the graphite component is a little more flaky. It's not quite as strong. But notice that the replacement period for the 1920s pipes is 2020, essentially. And that's why we're starting to see widespread main breaks in Flint. Just last Tuesday, we had a major main break that took out the whole north side of the city. And we had a boil water alert. That can cause big problems because you have to shut the water off, and then stagnant water in the pipes can leach more lead and also becomes conduits for inflows of bacteria. So here's our funding status in terms of what the American Society of Civil Engineers calls the funding gap. So notice right now in drinking water, $20 billion was funded, but $15 billion was unfunded. And this gap is widening, they project, every 20 years. So in 2040, this gap will be, what actually needs to be funded will exceed what was funded. This chart just shows what's in Flint. We have 600 miles of main pipes that are primarily cast iron. Some of the older pipes built in the 1890s were actually made out of wood, and a few of those are actually still in there. Where, we don't know. But a lot of older cities have wood as conduits for water. 80 years old is about the average age of the mains. We have 4,300 lead service lines. Those are the pipes that go from the mains into the home. Now, they're not necessarily all made of lead. Remember, there's two sections. There's a section that goes from the main to the curb stop valve, and then from the curb stop valve into the house. A lot of times what happened is that the city would ask the homeowner, can we replace your lead service line? Problem is that the service line going from the curb stop into the house is the homeowner's responsibility, and it costs several $1,000s to replace. So what happened quite often was that the city would replace the lead component only up until the curb stop, and then with copper, and then you'd have lead remaining running into the house. Well, that created a galvanic cell. So you had a copper to lead connection and an electrolyte solution of water, and that creates a situation where you can have galvanic corrosion. In aggressive water, that's what happened in Flint. We have 25,000 copper service lines, 11,000 of galvanized, and then we have 13,000 of unknown. And that was missing data. And that's a result of those cards not having adequate information that got transferred to the parcel maps. We had 378 main ruptures during 2015 and an average of over 300 from 2011 to the present. Right now we're looking into the spatial correlation between main ruptures and the outbreak of Legionella that occurred in the city, in the county, that has killed 10 people over the last year and a half. Professor Mark Edwards of Virginia Tech did a simulation in the laboratory, and he looked at how much aging had occurred as a result of the aggressive water that Flint had used for 19 months when it switched off of the Detroit water system and began drawing water from the Flint River. And he estimated that the pipes aged an additional 11 and a half years. This is already a pipe network that's on the edge of its useful lifespan. And major pipe ruptures are continuing. So this is the service connection line I've been talking about. So you have the street here, here's your water main. It could be a 24-inch, 36-inch cast iron pipe. This right here is called the corporate valve. This goes right into the curve box. Here's your ground switch right here, where only the wrench from the utility can open that and close it. And then you have the service line leading into the house right there. So quite often what would happen is this might be all lead, the city would replace this pipe, this portion of the pipe. Homeowner could not afford to replace this portion, and then you'd have a copper to lead connection. And we had several thousand of those that we found in the data. Age is a big determinant of the potential for there being lead in a structure, not to mention other presence of lead within the paint, and even improper grounding of electrical devices to water lines can cause corrosion. I know I've been in people's homes where their wells have been, their electrical system has been grounded to their well. And that's not good, because wells also have lead components. If your well was built before 1991, there's a good chance that your packer element, which is the element just above your water intake, could be made of lead. Michigan statute in 1991 outlawed the use of lead in well materials, but brass also has lead in it, up to 8%. So brass fixtures, faucets, fittings, that could have lead. In 2011, NSF Rule 61 lowered the amount of lead which could be present in brass to 0.25% on a weighted average of all the fixtures in the house. But the law didn't go into effect until 2014. A lot of people have homes with brass fixtures that are older than 2011 or 2014. So here's just a breakdown of what I've talked about already. Flint's average age of home is 74 years. These old homes are shown in red on the map here. And look at this concentric ring here that we have, with the older homes located near downtown and around it in a donut. And then on the outlying areas, you have the newer homes built between 1951 and 1986. And then only a few places in Flint, right here and right here, have new construction, relatively new, built after 1987. So it's quite possible that almost every home in Flint might have some type of lead component that water passes over before it reaches people for consumption. So here's just a quick breakdown of what we think happened. When we switched when the water supply was switched, the water had a higher organic content. I know when I took water treatment here from Professor Glisson in the Civil Engineering Department, he mentioned that Ann Arbor used what was called a split treatment. They took water from Barton Pond, and then they also, to cool it down, they used groundwater from the south side of the city near the airport, because treating water that's warm is problematic. So they needed to cool it off a little bit, and they got that through groundwater. Groundwater is typically at about 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the average temperature of the earth. So it's a little cooler than river water. River water, though, has a lot of organic material in it. There's this crud that falls into river water. Pine needles, leaves, animal feces, you name it. You have to account for that in your treatment process. There's also a lot of salt that runs off into surface water bodies if they're inland, as opposed to the Great Lakes. So there's going to be high chloride contents. So that water may be naturally more aggressive and create a lot more corrosive potential once it goes through the pipes. The Flint River had an average chlorine content of 85 parts per million, whereas Lake Huron was much less at only 11 parts per million. So by switching over, not only did Flint take on a more aggressive water with chloride on it, it took over water that had more total organic carbon as a dissolved component. So then they added iron chloride to it, ferrochloride, to try to control those free organics. That lowered the residual chlorine levels. And then we started getting total trihalomethane problems in the city as well. Initially, we had boil water alerts for fecal coliform, and then we had total trihalomethane problems, which comes from chlorine combining with organic acids, essentially. Chloroform is one of the major compounds. There's bromoform, dichlorobromoethane. There's typically 4 trihalomethane compounds. They take the average concentration of, and they come up with a total trihalomethane count. Well, that exceeded the MCL, which is the maximum contaminant level. So they had that problem. And then pipes typically develop a coating or a passivation layer, which involves some scale, which keeps a lot of the bad contaminants like lead inert and immobile. But we kept having a lot of bacterial contamination, and bacterial contamination can form on pipes and house itself in biofilms. And also with all the pipe ruptures that Flint was having, a lot of those colonies or biofilms could migrate from one place to other places as well. And then we had protective scale was breaking down as well in these pipes. Also through the galvanic corrosion was also starting to occur because the chloride-sulfide mass ratio started to get exceeded. When that gets over about 0.5, you start getting the risk of having lead leach, where you have lead in the water supply, in plumbing. So that formed that galvanic cell, and all those lead pipes, and there's really only about 200 pure lead pipes left in the city of Flint. Most of them are hybrids, some type of lead to copper or copper to lead, or tubuloy, which is a stainless steel compound to lead, or zinc to lead. But about 4,300 pipes we know are lead, and with all those missing, we estimate about 1/3 of those are lead, so that's going to bring the total amount of lead services going into people's homes to about 8,000. Which is equivalent to the number of lead pipes that the city of Lansing has been digging out over the last 10 years. And also the city of Madison, Wisconsin proactively dug out from the year 2001 to 2010. pH is very important. There's certain levels of pH where anti-corrosion treatment works very well, particularly about 7.3 to 7.8 is your target range. But the Flint water treatment people did not have a target range. When questioned, they never came up with a target pH that they were treating their water with. In fact, part of the problem here and part of the criminal investigation is that they never did they never did add anti-corrosive compounds to the water. They said they did, but they never did. So someone's probably going to pay for that. And what the anti-corrosion compounds typically consist of are some form of phosphate compound, typically orthophosphate, and it's a sodium phosphate, and it immobilizes the lead. It forms a lead phosphate coating, and that helps keep the lead in place. We began that treatment in January of 2016, but we're still getting very high lead levels today. People are getting, the maximum contamination level for lead is 15 parts per billion, even though no lead is deemed safe, which is one of the issues we have with the lead and copper rule. We also don't know what the status of the biofilms are in the pipes. We have a lot of pipe transients, meaning pressure surges where there's unequal pressures, pipe ruptures. Those things can cause disruption in biofilms, cause the biofilms to break, migrate to other areas. We think, there's some people who think that Legionella can get harbored within these biofilms. And if these things break off, then Legionella becomes mobilized and is in the water supply. Let's take a look, that's a summary of some of the physical factors. Let's take a look at some of the social, political factors. From 1978 to the present, Flint lost 75,000 jobs in auto. There's only 5,000 auto-related jobs left in Flint. 41% of Flint is poor. It's below the official poverty level of the United States. And 57% of children in Flint are poor. Just yesterday, a report came out that said that Flint has the highest level of residential vacancy of any city in the United States. 7.5%. It's 4.5 times the national average. There's a legacy of union membership, for instance, the UAW, and there's a long history of institutional racism, which has been chronicled through the National Housing Act of 1934, which actually set up the redlining system. On the old neighborhood maps that were used for determining loaning money for homes, they developed 4 categories, A, B, C, and D, and attached to each category was a color. The A category was the most desirable areas of the city, usually all white areas that were high income, and those got green lines. The latter, going down the line, category D was the worst category, usually poor, heavily minority neighborhoods that received red lines. Andrew Highsmith, in his book Demolition Means Progress, which just came out, chronicles a lot of this activity. Here's the population loss, 196,000 people in the 1960 census, which is now down to 102,000. If you look at the American Community Survey, which is the later projections in 2013, Flint's population now is listed at 98,000. Majority African American. And Flint was under emergency manager control from the state of Michigan. I have a quote here from the director of the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, who said that the final decision to switch water sources was actually made primarily on an interim basis between the emergency manager of Detroit and the emergency manager of Flint. So let's review what lead is. Lead's a metal, elemental. It's found below the surface. It's typically found in ores that are associated with zinc, copper, and silver. It's used in paints, ceramics. It used to be used in gasoline, batteries, cosmetics, solder until 1986. Lead-based paint is one way we can get exposed to it. That's typically the way most children get exposed to lead-based paint. Contaminated soil, household dust. Several recent studies have come out which indicate that vacuum cleaners resuspend particles from the floor, and that can be a pathway of ingestion. You only can get lead 2 ways. You either eat it and drink it, or it goes through your respiratory system. Transdermal absorption is not a big factor with lead. So no amount of lead is safe. The effects include decreased academic achievement, decreased IQ, cognitive problems, kidney function problems, reduced fetal growth. So here's just a schematic of what some of the sources of lead are: paint, water, pottery, soil, toys. A lot of toys are painted with lead paint. And you know what children do with toys. Brass fixtures, electrical devices grounded to water pipes and wells also. So let's talk a little bit about recovery. How do we get out of this mess? Well, Classical risk assessment has essentially 3 steps to it. It's got a hazard identification stage, exposure assessment, and exposure response, or what in the health field sometimes is called dose response. Hazard identification consists of identifying what hazardous agents are present, who was exposed, and what are their potential effects. In Flint, we have not done that completely yet. What's lacking is a complete understanding of who was exposed, because Flint's population swells by 30 to 50,000 every day because we have incoming workers and incoming students. There's 4 universities in Flint: Baker, Mott, Kettering, and University of Michigan Flint. There's a lot of college students that come into Flint every day to go to school. There's still 2 major auto plants in Flint. There's 2 major hospitals. There's a lot of people coming in on a daily basis. Those people for 19 months drank the water. So we may have to track them down too. Then we have to find out what level they were exposed. Our exposure assessment. That's going to be tough because lead's half-life in the blood is very short. So what we do with children is we track them over time. A lot of social service agencies, and make sure that they get the early interventions involve good nutrition, particularly diets high in vitamin C and calcium and iron, have been shown to have a good effect at least retarding the most nasty effects of lead poisoning in the brain. But you can't reverse the damage that's already been done. And then, what's the likelihood of having an adverse effect? Well, some of these effects don't show up for 15 years or 20 years. That's going to be very difficult to show. So that's risk assessment. Risk analysis also includes the response. So what are we doing to solve this problem? What can we do to create acceptable levels of risk? And part of that comes from learning about other water contamination events. The reason we as academics do literature searches before we write a paper is that we want to find out what's been done in the field so we don't duplicate the efforts that other people have already done. It would look kind of stupid if you submitted a paper and somebody had already written on the same subject you wanted to write about. Likewise, if we're responding to a hazard, it makes sense that we look to other communities to see what they've done and how they've responded in an analogous situation. And not every situation is exactly alike. In fact, we don't have many lead events in this country. We've had 4 before Flint. There was one in Washington, D.C., Durham, North Carolina, Boston, Massachusetts, and I think another East Coast city. But in terms of magnitude, the most instructive episode occurred in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Because in Milwaukee, people lost faith and trust in their institutions and in their water supply. And that's exactly what's happened in Flint. And that's why I also went through the social factors. Because if we're going to recover, we're going to have to involve a lot of people in the process. And doing so has to account for those cultural, ethnic, and social characteristics of the community in order to make a recovery effective. So let's take a look at just stepping through the typical risk assessment procedure, what this might entail. Well, we certainly want to do a lot of testing, and that's been done. The EPA is doing what we call sequential testing. They take a water sample of 100 milliliters from what's called a first draw sample. Water has to sit for 6 hours, and then you draw it out fairly rapidly into 100 milliliters. You cap it, you send it to the lab, and then you do it again. And that represents a little bit farther down in the pipe system. So it allows you to characterize where in the pipe, that service line, where some of the lead may be leaching from. Especially where you've got hybrid system, where they may have replaced some of the pipes and the service line leading into your house might be galvanized, but there's still lead out by the curb box, you have to sample enough to make sure that the water you draw doesn't necessarily represent what has touched the galvanized part, but what's coming from the lead portion of the pipe. So that's where this sequential sampling can capture some of that characteristics of the pipe replacements that have occurred. We have blood lead levels. Every child is told to get a blood lead level test, but that doesn't happen, especially in poor communities. So we have huge gaps in terms of these data, but we do have some. And we need other water quality parameters. We need microbiology in order to understand what's happening with the biofilms. When the problem happened in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, what they did to help regain people's confidence was cryptosporidium is a protozoan. And what's particularly nasty about cryptosporidium is that it forms an oocyte when it leaves the host body. An oocyte is a hard protective covering, so it can live outside the host for several months. And then when it's taken up by another host, it then goes into the small intestine and starts causing all kinds of gastrointestinal problems. So people who are immune compromised have a lot of problems with it. And if you have AIDS or rheumatoid arthritis or some type of immune disease, it can kill you. And it doesn't really respond well to antibiotics either. So, and it can come from feedlot runoff, from cattle, from beavers. I mean, any kind of wild animal can, or domesticated animal can produce literally millions of cysts in their stool. So that can get into the water. If that gets into the water supply, you've got huge problems. And it did in Milwaukee in 1993. 400,000 people, as I mentioned before, got sick. How do they regain confidence in their water supply after that event? Well, they went to the intake. They started at the lake. Milwaukee's on Lake Michigan. And they took samples of the water they were getting at the intake, and they took samples further out, and they found out that the water quality was better further out, so they moved the intake. And they let everybody know they did that. Then they went into the treatment plant, and they said, well, you know what, this cryptosporidium is 5 to 6 microns in size. We're going to put filtration in of 1 micron. We're going to make sure that we filter this thing out. They didn't stop there, though. I think that probably would have handled the problem. But what they needed to do was to overcompensate because people had lost confidence. So the Safe Drinking Water Act requires that you test for 91 different contaminants. The city of Milwaukee started testing for more. They started testing for trace pharmaceuticals and other microbiological agents. That gave people confidence that the public utility now was going to be on top of the problem should any new challenges pose themselves to their water system. Now, it took some time. It didn't happen overnight, but eventually they regained confidence. Now, we have to locate where the lead is. The perception in Flint, in Milwaukee, the perception was that the water intake was bad. The perception in Flint is that it's the lead. And if you talk to any Flint resident who has anything, an older home, they want lead removed from the plumbing system completely. So we have to locate all people exposed too, to get a full accounting of what happened. Now, the lead and copper rule was made in 1991. It's essentially a recognition by the EPA. It's what we call administrative law. And cabinet-level agencies of the U.S. government can make their own law. It's called administrative law. They publish rules, and then it becomes law as part of the Code of Federal Regulations. There's 4 different add-ons to the Safe Drinking Water Act amendments of 1986, and one of them is the lead and copper rule. It mandates that public utilities, depending upon their size, have to proactively sample every 6 months a certain number of their customers' water at the tap with a first draw sample to look for lead and copper. And the intent of the law is that you should do it in places where you expect there's a high risk of lead, because you really want to find this stuff. Now it's starting to come out more and more that a lot of water utilities are dodging this responsibility by looking in areas where that may not be such high risk, so that it's not, so they come back with negative tests on their lead. So here's a proposed risk parameter model. This is something just that I developed in the last few days, just looking at some of the data that we have. If we took health risk as a dependent variable from lead, we could say it's a function of the known sites of high lead water levels, known areas of high blood lead levels, water residence time within the distribution system, the age of the structure, the density of children aged 0 to 6 within that area, and a clustering coefficient of lead pipes and the spatial proximity to pipe ruptures. If you took all those factors together and then you added in, as you sampled, spatial proximity of additional microbiological parameters as they're acquired, you'd have a pretty good idea of the risk associated with each parcel, whether or not they would have a high level of lead risk. And we're going to need to do this because we've got 13,000 parcels where we don't know if there's lead or not. Now we can go into the house and we can scratch the inlet water pipe into the house, into the water meter, below the intake valve. You take a key and a magnet, you scrape it, and if it looks like a penny, it's copper. If it looks like dull and it's magnetic, it's galvanized. But if it looks dull and it's not magnetic, it's lead. But you're not safe even with galvanized, because I went into one of my students' homes and we did the test on his home, and it was galvanized, but he had a lead fitting. So lead shows up in a lot of different places. So here's how we developed the maps. We started with the index cards. We looked at them and we just jumped back about 3 feet and we said, we're not touching those. What else do you have? And luckily they had put the code of the type of service connection into the house on parcel maps, and they'd scanned those to tagged image files. We georeferenced each TIFF image to an existing parcel layer. So that was a process of 4 corners of 240 different segments of different areas. That took us about a day and a half. And then we created an edit layer of parcels and we overlaid the TIFF image on it, and we selected the parcels and transferred the code to an attribute layer within the active editing layer of the GIS. An image doesn't give you any manipulative ability on the computer. You can just display it, but you can't select it. When you put it into a database, you can do cluster analysis on it. You can do spatial statistics on it. You can do other things with it. So we finished this for 56,000 parcels, and we had a quality control of only a less than 1% error rate on 56,000 parcels, which we thought was pretty good. It's probably lower now because we went through and corrected those errors we found. But we still have 11,000 missing parcels. We're going to have to follow up with those. And that's anyone who works in Geographic Information Systems knows that the computer doesn't give you the answer, it just gives you the roadmap. So you have to go out into the field and verify what the computer's telling you on the map. So we're going to have to get into people's homes. This offers a unique opportunity to start addressing the premise plumbing and the other sources of lead within the house. So earlier I mentioned that Flint could become a model nationwide for lead abatement and getting rid of this toxin in the environment. Now we have to do it carefully. You just can't take a federal agency and knock on people's doors and say, hey, let us in. We want to get the lead out of your house. You have to organize people, and they have to have trust in the people who are coming into their house. And unfortunately, Flint has a very highly organized community structure. A lot of religious-based organizations have deep roots in the community, a lot of block clubs. At that level, we're going to have to get down to so people can trust who's coming into their home and will cooperate in these investigations. And then we have to locate other people too who have been exposed, and we can do this perhaps through employee lists. We can geocode where the people live. We can contact them, map them out, and find out, did you drink the water the time you came to Flint? So this is the map I'm not supposed to show you. This is the lead service line map of the city of Flint. This has the 4,376 locations. So if someone asked me, is there a part of the city that has a cluster? I said, yeah, all of it. Notice the ring closely corresponds to that earlier map I showed you with housing age, and that the outer areas, which were yellow on the housing map age, don't have a lot of lead. Okay? I'm going to blow this area up for you here, and there you get an indication that some blocks are complete, every parcel on the block has lead. And what we'll probably do is we'll look at, oops, I'm sorry. I have a higher education, but a lower education in working a clicker. We'll look at blocks like this and say, you know what? There's a very high likelihood that parcel's lead. Okay? So this map will help guide our initial inquiry into where we're going to test and perhaps gain access into homes. You look at something like this, where you got one or two parcels per block, who knows? Now this is the missing data. So we have an awful lot of missing data all over the city. Now clearly this is not a residential parcel. That would be an interesting lot for a home. But again, in that area of the city, which I just showed, which had high lead right here, we still have a lot of missing. Okay? So there's plenty of work to do here. So the last part of the three basic parts of a risk assessment involves exposure response, and that is going to be complicated by lead's half-life in the blood, because we really won't be able to tell necessarily who has been exposed through blood testing. It just won't show up. So it's going to require long-term monitoring of the population, particularly children. That's where a lot of the cost comes in. I talked about cryptosporidium in Milwaukee. The public lost confidence. The utility moved the water intake. They upgraded filtration. They tested for more than 91 contaminants, and they reported all the results. So there's some good lessons here for Flint on moving forward on how they can regain public confidence in their water supply. So we need to activate our available scientific and community resources. Right now they've only got, they've retained Professor Edwards from Virginia Tech to oversee some of the sampling, and they've got Dr. Hannah Atisha on an advisory panel, but nobody else. We've got Kettering University and our university. We have a lot of engineers. We have a lot of expertise in water resources in general. We have a lot of people with community work in their past and in their present, and we need to activate those resources. We need to collect data in a culturally sensitive way. We need to inform, educate, and create trusted, and make sure people trust what's being done. That's a huge, huge issue. We have to remove the actual threat. People perceive that to be the lead in the pipes. And then we should go beyond the legal requirements. Maybe just removing the pipes isn't enough. Maybe we need to make sure that we have nutrition programs set up at all the schools so young people can have that longer term. We have to do a complete infrastructure overhaul. We've got a pipe system here that's really creaky. So what are we going to do about that? We could solve our lead problem, and then we could start having Legionnaires again. So government needs to organize and acquire and organize and use all the available expertise. They need to consult with the community and then lead by example. For instance, it would be good if the government buildings in the city of Flint took the lead in doing a lead audit and got all the lead out of their buildings. For instance, in Chicago right now, Chicago's taken the lead in the environment by requiring that all new government buildings have green roofs. So that's how government can lead by example. and then sponsor research and publish all the findings. The community needs to be involved with the response because they're the conduits for public action and response, and they need to maintain pressure. Unfortunately, they're going to have to keep their foot on the pedal. So I've just, to end it here, I've just presented 3 scenarios, 3 possibilities of response that might occur. Now, none of these may occur. This is just, we're just blue skying here. The minimalist approach, and one that personally I think is very inadequate, would be to keep the emergency manager coat the pipes with some type of anti-corrosion treatment until perhaps lead testing showed that the water lead levels had dropped, and then provide money for nutrition and social service follow-up. Now that's already been done, so that's in there. Another scenario would go a bit further, remove the emergency manager, coat the pipes, provide the money, so again, this is just what was in the first one, and then add replacing all the service pipes and then improve the lead and copper rule sampling procedure. Right now, we allow 10% of the samples to skate by if they're over the level. It's the 90th percentile, that's the key value. Do you want to be one of the 10% who has high lead levels in your home? I mean, if any level of lead is deemed a threat to your health, why don't we have that as part of the rule? And then scenario 3, again, contains everything from the first 2, and then it identifies all the lead in the water distribution system, involves community and premise plumbing and total lead removal efforts, performs a complete water system audit, looking at where the residence time problems are, valves, pumps, mains, all the infrastructure, and then samples regularly for more contaminants. Okay, so that would be going, again, this is modeled on the Milwaukee response. Okay, any questions?
They actually allow microorganisms to grow inside as time goes on, and they will be in your water that you draw from the filter. There are some